This story comes from medieval Rome. In 896 AD, Pope Formosus died. The following year, a new pope, Stephen VI, convened a synod, a council of senior clergy, and put the corpse of his predecessor on trial. Day after day, Stephen presided over this unholy court. Bishops and clergy who had been coerced, threatened or were eager to ingratiate themselves with the new Spolitan-backed regime testified against the corpse, listing grievances, both real and fabricated. And the deacon stood by the decomposing body, whispering a defense into its ear and then voicing it to the court. He denies the charge. He states he acted for the good of the church, and so it went. The corpse of Pope Formosus was cross-examined, its silence taken as guilt, its very state, the rotting flesh, the falling skin, was held up not as a memento mori, a reminder of all men's fate, but as a visible symbol of his inner corruption. The stench in the hall must have been unbearable. Imagine the bishops in their fine robes, handkerchiefs pressed to their noses, trying to maintain their composure as they participated in this sacrilegious farce. The psychological pressure was immense. To witness this was to be complicit. Stephen was not just trying Formosus, he was binding the entire Roman clergy to his own vendetta, making them accessories to the crime. After a trial that lasted days, the verdict was pronounced. Formosus was found guilty on all counts. Pope Stephen VI, with grim satisfaction, passed sentence. The first part of the sentence was doctrinal. All of Formosus's acts as pope were declared null and void. His ordinations were invalid. The priests he had ordained, the bishops he had consecrated, the very popes he had crowned, they were all gone, swept away like chaff in the wind. Every priest in the church, every bishop, every cardinal, every monk, nun and friar, they were nothing. Their orders were revoked. They were returned to the state of holy orders from which they had come. Priests were no longer priests. In effect, Stephen had severed the links of authority from the center, creating a theological and administrative chaos from which his own faction would emerge victorious. Then came the physical sentence. The papal vestments were torn from the corpse. This was a symbolic stripping of his office, but done to a decomposing body. It was an act of savage desecration. The 3 fingers of his right hand, the fingers he had used to confer blessings, to make the sign of the cross, to hold the Eucharist, were chopped off. A visceral, brutal severing of his sacerdotal power. But it was not over. The sentence extended beyond the courtroom. The mutilated body was dragged by a mob out of the Lateran Palace and through the streets of Rome. It was treated as a common criminal's corpse, jeered and spat upon. It was thrown into a pit for foreigners, burial reserved for the lowest of the low. Even that was not enough. Legend has it that a few days later, the body was disinterred one final time and dragged to the Ponte Sant'Angelo, the bridge across the Tiber River facing the great Castel Sant'Angelo. There, it was tied with weights and thrown into the muddy waters, a final effort to erase him from memory and deny his soul Christian rest, condemning him to wander there as a restless spirit. Stephen VI sat back, victorious. He had humiliated his enemy, pleased his Spoleto and backers, and purged the church of the Formosus heresy. He believed he had won. He could not have been more wrong. He had not buried the ghost of Formosus. He had given it a power far greater than it ever had in life. He had unleashed a judgment that was now turning, slowly and inexorably, back upon himself. The Tiber carried the body away. But the memory of the deed festered in the city, and a reckoning was coming. But let's go back to the beginning. Formosus was born in 816 AD near the Italian city of Asti. The details of his early life are unknown, lost to history. What we do know is that he studied in France at the monastery of Cluny, a center of intellectual life in the Carolingian Renaissance. He eventually rose to become the abbot of Cluny. Formosus was ambitious and politically astute. He knew how to play the game of church and state. He made powerful enemies, and one of them proved influential. In 891, when Formosus was 75 years old, a Frenchman named Lambert, the second son of Louis the Pious, died unexpectedly in Rome. Before his passing, he designated the future pope as the tutor of his young son and heir, also called Lambert, a position that gave Formosus control of the considerable family fortune and a fair amount of political clout. When the young Lambert died only 2 years later, Formosus used his influence to push the next of kin, another distant relative, to become pope. In return, he was made Bishop of Porto. In 896, when Pope Theodore II died, Formosus ran for the papacy, and won. His rise was meteoric, swift, and decisive. That should have been the end of the story. But politics can be a fickle mistress. Formosus was a product of the era of party popes. In the 9th century, the consensus among the clergy was that popes should be elected by the consensus of the whole church, cardinals, bishops, abbots, monks, and even lay churchgoers having a say. In practice, however, it was a system dominated by factions, each backed by secular rulers. The factions fought constantly for supremacy. And as the rivalries escalated, so did the brutality of the tactics used by the various factions. Violence became commonplace. Assassinations were regular occurrences. So when the Spoleto family began maneuvering for a favorable candidate, threatening violence if necessary, Formosus wasn't exactly surprised. Spoleto was a small Italian state north of Rome. In the 9th and 10th centuries, it was ruled by a family whose wealth and power derived mainly from their ability to collect and exploit church revenues. Powerful but not powerful enough to elect a pope directly, the Spoletians needed allies, especially in Rome, where rival factions were coalescing around the families of the Tusculani and the Crescenzi. Though they had succeeded in installing their chosen pope, Formosus had made powerful enemies along the way. The Tusculani and the Crescenzi were furious about being sidelined. They wanted revenge. Enter the Spoletians, ready to help. And so a conspiracy formed. They lured Theodore away from Rome with promises of land and money, and then arrested the pope. They threw him into a dungeon in the castle of Spoleto and left him there to die. Formosus's cell was dark and damp. The air hung heavy with the smell of decay. The food was moldy and stale. The water from the dripping pipes tasted of rust. As weeks turned into months, Formosus grew thinner and weaker. His clothes, once fine and stately, were ragged and filthy. Yet he never broke. He resisted the temptation to plead for mercy. He endured his imprisonment with stoic dignity, a martyr of the papal office. His reward, a delayed death and a violent end. On March 11, 897, he suffered a heart attack and died. His body was thrown into the Tiber River and bobbed along the current until it washed up near the bank. The next morning, it was found by some fishermen who dragged it out of the water, laid it on a nearby pyre and burned it. His ashes were gathered, placed in a simple wooden box, and buried in a church near where he had died. Only 6 months later, the Spoletians were on the run. Formosus's successor, Stephen VI, who had been installed at their behest, was proving to be a liability. He quickly fell out of favor with his own masters, and in a desperate bid to stay in power, he tried to curry favor with the other factions. He declared war on Spoleto, only to lose the support of the emperor. Desperate, he turned to Constantinople and asked the Eastern Roman Emperor for troops. Now in alliance with the emperor, Stephen VI was free to pursue his personal vendetta against the dead pope. So he opened a secret archive, digging up rumors and accusations about Formosus's past. He found enough to indict him for heresy and summoned a synod of bishops to try him for them. At the time, the concept of posthumous prosecution was hardly radical. It happened often enough. After all, souls were judged for sins committed on earth. Why not judge them on earth for sins committed in life? Such was the logic of the age. For the next 11 months, Formosus's tomb remained undisturbed. Then in November of 897, the crypt was opened and the body was dragged forth. Today, we can look back on the story of the Cadaver Synod and shake our heads in disbelief. How could educated people believe that a dead man could defend himself? How could they accept the mutilation of a saint? How could they participate in the desecration of a corpse? Well, because they had no choice. In a world where church and state were intertwined, where the temporal and the spiritual were inseparable, where religion permeated every aspect of life, the pressure to conform was immense. To dissent was to risk not only social ostracism, but physical harm or even death. The alternatives were unthinkable. You either submitted or you suffered the consequences. Imagine living in a time when every decision, every action, every breath you took, was scrutinized and controlled by those in power, when every word you spoke could be twisted and used against you, when every move you made could lead to ruin. That was their reality. We forget that these men were human beings, albeit ones living in a very different world. They had hopes and dreams, fears and ambitions. They loved and lost. They laughed and cried. They were complex individuals trying to navigate a treacherous path. They weren't robots programmed to follow orders blindly. They were people grappling with a moral dilemma. Some chose obedience, others dissent. Some chose safety, others risk. Some chose silence, others truth. The story of the Cadaver Synod isn't just a tale of medieval barbarism. It's a story of courage and conviction. These men weren't monsters. They were human beings, trying to survive in a world where survival meant compromising their principles. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The question is, what would you have done? Would you have submitted or would you have spoken up? Would you have remained silent or would you have risked everything to tell the truth? These men faced that choice. They didn't have the luxury of ignorance or innocence. They had to choose between obedience and conscience, between fear and conviction, between silence and truth. We can marvel at their courage or criticize their choices, but ultimately, we should remember that they were just people trying to get by in a world that demanded more than they could give.